Hello and welcome to the next lesson in our Rust recipes series. And during this section, we are going to be looking at Rocket, which is basically a framework for building websites and web services and everything like that. And it's built on top of lots of macros. In some ways, this will give you a show of what can be done with a lot of macros to make things work really smoothly. So to find out more about it, you can go to rocket.rs, and there's plenty of information in the guide. But we're just going to get started by turning our Doodle database into a web service. We are going to introduce how this all works and how we can serve a simple static page. Cargo new, and we'll call it D7 Rocket. We'll get into main Rocket and open up our cargo.toml. So obviously we're going to need to import Rocket, and the version is 0.4.2. We're also going to need failure and failure derive, both of which it's 0.1.5. So if we open up our main file, and in our main method, we're going to write rocket : ignite, and that creates the rocket builder. Then we're going to launch it, which is basically the done method. So this actually will start our rocket server. It's a server that's basically just going to return an error on every single case. But before we can run this, again, because Rocket depends on nightly Rust currently, we need to set our default usage to nightly. So that is rust up override set nightly. And obviously you may need to do a rust up install nightly if you haven't done that already, or update if it's been a while. Rocket only really guarantees it's working on the latest nightly. And then if we run cargo run, and hey presto, the server is up and running. So if we go to a localhost, and then it's 8000, which is what it said, here we get a 404 that the requested resource could not be found. So let's actually give some resources for it to find. Before we can do this, we're going to need to enable some feature flags. So hash and then interrobang to say this is for the crate. And then a feature, proc macro hygiene. And we also want declarative macros. These are two features that are required for the macros in Rocket. And we're going to bring in Rocket with extern use on its macros. So hash macro use extern crate Rocket. So that brings in all of the macros from the Rocket library. So we'll have hash square bracket get, and then in quotes, the root path, and then close bracket square. And we'll have a function for root. So this will be what people get when they come to the very root of, I guess, the website in this case. But practically this will work on any URL as you're working here. So we'll take root, and this will return a result. And the result will impl responder. This is a type from Rocket. And that requires a lifetime, but we can just say we promise that the lifetime of this responder will be static. And the error type will be a failure error. Rocket actually handles the error types directly, and I think in most cases it just returns a 500 internal server error, though we can change that, and we will change that shortly. We have to use a Rocket response responder, and we also want to use a named file. Now we'll go into more about what a responder is in the next video. But we're going to return a named file of a file from our directory. So in this case, this will be named file, : open, and we'll just give a path to a file. So that will be site, static, and then index.html. And this actually returns a result with an error that can be converted to failure error, but we're going to have to map error to do that. Or we could do an OK with a question mark. My preference seems to be this way. Map error e.into, so that will just convert the error to the correct type based on how Rust works out what the right types are. So now we better write that file. So I'm going to make a directory called site static, and this is from the root of the project. And inside that, I'm going to edit a file called index.html. Let's just write some HTML. Now this isn't, of course, in HTML, so I'm just going to write out what is a basic HTML page here with what I consider the bare minimum of a HTML document. Actually, let's also include a login form here. So form action equals, and then login, which is the path that it's going to go to, and the method will be post. And this will need a username and a password and a submit. So this is done by saying input, type equals, and then text and password for the appropriate ones. And the name, again, name and password. And finally, we need a submit button, which is also an input of type submit. And to set the text on this button, we use value, and we'll set that to login. We have one more thing we need to do before we can run this, and that is to mount this route onto our list of routes. So mount / and then on our routes list, and this is a macro, we can use a square brace, and we'll set route, which is the name of the function that we are now going to attach. So when we rerun the server and we refresh this page, we now have HTML page, which we have served up, and we can type in some login data. Now, if we wanted to be able to access static files, we can also create path notation like so, and we can put fixed parts of the path and dotted parts of the path like this in angle braces. And that says whatever comes after here, we'll call it path and we'll treat it like a path. Again, this is Rocket's macros making our life a lot simpler for accessing parts of the request. So in this case, we're going to take static files, and then path is the name of the variable, and this has to match the name of whatever we put inside the angle braces. And for this, we're going to call that a path buff, which is a Rust type that's really good at representing paths. It's part of the standard library. And we're going to return, again, our result will be something that implements responder. I often find it's helpful to write your APIs this way, your public methods, that you say what you're going to respond with by the trait that it implements. It means that if you do change your code, nothing that's depending on your code really changes because it's only depending on the trait anyway. And of course, it's going to have a failure error. So we'll let path equal path buff from site static. So that's going to be the base of the path. And then we're going to join that to our new path. And then we will return a named file with that path. And again, we'll have to map the error appropriately. And of course, we're going to need to import standard path buff. And before we run it again, we need to add that function to our list of mounts. Let's try looking at main CSS. There is no file there, so we get an internal server error. But if we look for index.html, and this is going through the static file route rather than from the base route. So that's a very quick setup of Rocket, but as I'm sure you can imagine, there are plenty of other ways of sending things out, all kinds of responses that you can create.